Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's intelligence briefing on influence operations mounting ahead of the US 2024 elections. We have released a public blog report with the same title today alongside this intelligence briefing, where you can read our entire report findings. And today is going to be a mixture of briefing the report's key findings, demoing the Record a Future platform on how to mitigate related threats, and Q&A throughout. So if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A chat of the webinar. I'm Craig Terran, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's intelligence briefing. I'm the director of the Global Issues team in Record a Future's Insikt Group, and I'm joined by Sean Miner and Brian Lister from my team. Sean, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure thing. Thanks, Craig. And hello, everybody. I'm Sean Miner. I am the team lead for influence operations research here at Record a Future's Insikt Group. And prior to this role, I was a senior threat intelligence analyst focused on global influence operations. And I look forward to this opportunity to speak about this important topic.
Great. Thank you, Sean. Brian, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Liston, and I am a senior intelligence analyst with Record a Future's Insikt Group. I've been studying and researching influence for operations out of Russia and election security for more than 5 years now. It's great to be with you all today, and I'm excited to discuss our research.
Great. Thank you so much. So with that, let's get started, and I will hand over to Sean for the summary.
Appreciate it, Craig. To kick things off here, we'll go ahead and hit an overarching summary of the key trends that we're seeing ahead of the November US 2024 election. Number one, we're assessing this year to really be a gloves-off approach is what we're calling it. And that's based primarily on the geopolitical environment around the world as we continue to see, for example, Russia's continued war against Ukraine, what's going on in the Middle East with Israel, Hamas, also now Iran, and then over to the Pacific and the South China Sea and just continued tension there between China and Taiwan. So based on just the broader geopolitical environment, we're assessing that to really increase the risk appetite from some of these key leaders from other governments around the world, thus really increasing the potential for a more aggressive approach to influencing or attempting to influence this year's US election. Number two, more along the thematic perspective here as far as influence narratives and things of that nature, we're seeing basically across the board from the top three being Russia, China, and Iran, attempts to just reduce overall US domestic support for providing military and financial assistance to US allies around the world. Here again, we can think about Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan primarily. Number three, we're seeing attempts to really undermine political candidates and projecting that, or specifically projecting unfavorable policies with respect to a specific threat actor's sponsor. There we can think of examples over the weekend, which I'm sure we'll discuss more, but Iran, for example, primarily pushing a negative rhetoric around former US President Donald Trump just based on their assessment that it potentially could have a negative impact on their own geopolitical objectives down the line, depending on the election results. Number four, we're definitely seeing a combination of just both old and new, innovative and I guess emerging influence tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs. And we're seeing this ranging from cyber-enabled influence operations, which throughout the brief, when we say cyber-enabled influence operations, that's a combination where it's a layered offensive cyber activity with influence operations. On top of that, we're seeing more integration with artificial intelligence capabilities, and that's really creating a change with regards to how threat actors are layering AI-enabled influence operations across the board. And then finally, we're assessing that currently, as we'll discuss today, we're assessing right now a low level of impact overall across the board with what we've been seeing since really December of last year. Low level of impact with regards to changing behavior or ultimately affecting voters ahead of the election. However, the big caveat there is we definitely assess that there's going to be a surge in destabilizing activities in the next weeks and months to come. And I think this past weekend is a perfect example of really supporting this assessment that we do foresee an increase here as the election approaches. And with that, I'll hand it back. Oh, before I do that, the images on the left, those are just examples of some content we've seen recently. And that top left is from Iranian state media with an article that's about a Persian translation of a book about the hypothetical disintegration of America. And it summarizes the recent popular movie, Civil War. And then that bottom left is an image from an influence network we'll discuss later, which we call Empire Dragon. And that was pushed basically, and that's a AI generated image that the network was amplifying on social media. And with that, I'll hand it back to Craig.
Great, thank you, Sean. We've got a question in the Q&A. Can you remind me what TTP is? That's a tactic, technique, and procedure. We actually quite like using the disarm blue TTPs. It's basically how an influence actor goes about, or a cyber threat actor goes about achieving their goals. Another question here we have, Sean. You already alluded to it. But have we already seen that gloves-off approach to the 2024 elections this past weekend with Iran's hack and leak operation against Trump's campaign?
Yes, I think this past weekend's a direct example of an assessment. Really, we've continued to make the assessment, I would say, since last December, that we've seen essentially a deliberate increase over time of just overall, for one, just content generation from the various networks, which we'll discuss as we move through today's presentation. But on top of that, we have been assessing based on past election cycles, especially 2020, that networks, specifically like some that we've tracked from Iran, will increase more of their cyber-enabled influence operations, which we saw over this past weekend based on open source reporting. And we'll discuss some more details there when we get to the Iran-related network. But I would say, yes, based on this, I think we're starting to really see that uptick, and it makes sense being 90 days out, essentially less than 90 days out from the election. And we certainly assess it to kind of be a continuing wave, if you will, as we get closer. We suspect that these networks will get more aggressive.
Great, thank you, Sean. And I know our team within Insikt Group, this team that focuses on state-sponsored cyber operations, I know they have a report in progress at the minute on potentially related Green Charlie, also known as Charlie Kitten activity, which could be related to that intrusion on Trump's campaign. Brian, a question for you. Have we seen all foreign influence networks using AI in their operations, or are some foreign adversaries using AI more than others?
That's a good question. With the boom of AI technology and generative AI, we've absolutely seen instances of nation states exploring how to use AI in their influence operations, and it does vary to degree, and it also varies in how they're employing it. Threat actors linked to China, for example, using AI imagery and visualizations, AI-made propaganda videos to memes and cartoons to full-on news productions. The Russia-linked influence network Doppelganger, as well as CopyCop campaigns, each have used generative AI to summarize and plagiarize and produce articles for their respective networks of websites. With all of that said, the use of AI tooling has improved, I would say, their efficiency in producing content. We previously determined that in research that AI could reduce costs significantly. However, that content that is produced, I would say, still continues to miss the mark in believability. Text using large language models, for example, still have a lot of many indicators of being AI written, whereas static and dynamic media, video and photo, also have giveaways and stylistic indicators.
Great, thank you, Brian. And to stay with you, Brian, for this next question, the final point on this slide here is that we currently assess low impact. How do you measure the impact of influence operations and whether they are successful or not?
Yeah, to start, just kind of reiterating that assessment, though holistically we've observed a considerable level of influence activity to manipulate that information space, we do assess these networks neither meaningfully impacted the 2024 election cycle, nor have they significantly altered voter behavior. Again, that question that we often get is how do we go about measuring a campaign for its effectiveness and its impact? At Recorded Future, we examine this through several different measurements and methodologies. First and foremost, as Craig, you mentioned, we've adopted examining an influence operation through the disarm framework, a framework that stylistically very similar to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. It's useful to us to easily explain an operation, its goals, and its TTPs, and as well as some mitigation options for practitioners and defenders. In our investigations, we also tend to use disarm to help build out our diamond model for influence operations analysis. To examine the influencer, which would be the individual targeting or conducting the influence operation, the target narrative, their capabilities and infrastructure, and of course their audience. Next, like a lot of other practitioners in this space, we're also reviewing the numeric impact or visibility of a campaign, such as something you might see on social media. That would be your likes and reshares, your engagement, your views, cross posting, amplification across multiple platforms, to get an idea of that breakout. Which brings me to one of our final tools that we tend to use a lot, and it's measuring impact by its ability to reach new audiences across what is referred to from the Brookings Institution as the breakout scale. Similarly to how one measures categories across, like, say, a hurricane, the breakout scale examines influence operations across 6 different categories. So quickly, at one end of the model, you have, you're observing a campaign on a single platform with no breakout. And then as you progress through that scale, you're measuring multiple platforms, multiple breakouts, different mediums, television, radio. Category 5, you're then looking at celebrity amplification all the way to a category 6, which would be something such as a policy change, a political resignation, a call to violence, or acts of violence.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Sean, anything to add there?
Brian covered most of it there. I guess I would add the report that we published today does discuss a term now that's being used called perception hacking. And this is something that we're very careful with when we conduct our assessments, specifically with regards to measures of effectiveness of a given network or threat actor. And essentially what threat actors, one technique that's being used now is a threat actor will basically attempt to manipulate or manifest a kind of a created reaction with a given influence operation. So long story short, we're very deliberate when we look at assessing any measures of performance or measures of effectiveness to look at online engagement metrics, such as impressions, like likes, shares, reposts, and trying to make assessments very deliberately to not overstate the effectiveness of any given network. And we've seen specifically Iran try to conduct some of this perception hacking recently, where even a hacktivist group may claim that they conducted a cyber attack, and in reality, nothing has physically happened. It's purely just an attempt to create a psychological reaction. So that is something that we'll keep an eye on as we move closer to the election, and most certainly not try to overstate the level of effectiveness of any of these networks.
All right. Thank you so much, Sean. So with that, let's jump into actually some of the influence networks that we've observed. And we'll start with Russia. So moving over to Brian.
Great. Thank you, Craig. Yeah, to start, just to keep everybody up to speed, like on our assessment from our report holistically on Russia, we're currently assessing that Russia is almost certainly conducting malign influence operations ahead of the 2024 elections through a number of tracked influence operation networks and pro-Kremlin sources. We're going to go through 3 of them this morning, starting with Doppelganger. That the Russia-linked operation that we've published a considerable amount of coverage on, and back in December and throughout this year on Doppelganger. It's almost certainly continues producing content that exploits socio-political divisions across the U.S. in multiple key election issues. In addition to your typical Russian IO objectives, which is anything from provoking internal discontent to causing chaos, Doppelganger continues to target the U.S. in the hope of eroding public confidence in sitting leadership and the U.S.'s standing pro-Ukraine policy. Again, consistent with our previous investigations in Doppelganger, as well as the research community at large, and there's a considerable amount of research spent on Doppelganger just because of its visibility. Doppelganger primarily conducts this activity through the impersonation of U.S. citizens, other countries as well, but for the purpose of this, U.S. citizens, by large, automated, coordinated, authentic behavior. You're talking tens of thousands of social media accounts being churned out very, very regularly. Impersonation of prominent U.S. and Western media organizations, and then a network of more than a dozen original inauthentic news portals, several of which include text that I mentioned this just a few moments ago, but we believe is created through in part with generative AI. Doppelganger strategically targets, again, those domestic wedge issues that we've seen from Russian IOs in the past: domestic policy, foreign policy, opportunistically with breaking news events. And that's almost with the certain aim of driving social division and exploiting those U.S. Political rifts that we've seen these campaigns be doing for cycles now. Doppelganger, as I said, it also remains very opportunistic, targeting breaking news stories and trending topics, whether that be U.S. campus-related unrest this past spring, President Biden's withdrawal from the race this past month, and then the attempted assassination of former President Trump. For those in the audience on this slide, there are some screenshots of some recent inauthentic headlines featured on Doppelganger clones of legitimate Western media. The bottom of those three screenshots is one of their inauthentic news portals, this one being mypride.press.
Great, thank you, Brian. So that takes us to our first demo. So as we saw there, Doppelganger has impersonated legitimate media organizations, and threat actors do the same to other organizations, such as cybercriminals impersonating a financial company to scam customers. And this can cause reputational damage to the impersonated organizations, which is why brand protection is so important. So just to jump over to our first demo here. So this is the intelligence card for Doppelganger, which is the network Brian was just discussing. And at the very top, we can see the Insikt Group research links, which are all of the different links Insikt Group has associated with this network. We can see some more of the domains which we've linked to Doppelganger, including some of those mainstream media organizations that have been impersonated. In this case, we'll choose the mypride.press, which is one of the images that Brian just had on the slide there. So this takes us to the intelligence card for the mypride.press domain, which is one of the Doppelganger domains. And this intelligence card provides an overview of this domain. So we can see the summary at the top. It gives us the option to submit it to the sandbox for analysis. There's a screenshot, and then Record Future AI provides a nice summary of it as well. We can then go into more detail. We can have a look at the risk rules that have triggered. We can see the risk score of this domain over time. So it's previously ranked as malicious before dropping to suspicious. And we're fully transparent as to why that is as well. You can see all of the different risk rules just below there. And then we can see the Insikt Group research in more detail as well. So unsurprisingly, Insikt Group research on the Doppelganger network, because this domain belongs to Doppelganger. We can now actually pivot over to our intelligence goals library over here on the left. So our intelligence goals library are a list of pre-configured alerting rules that our clients can just activate. And one of the really important ones for brand protection here is the potential logo abuse detection. So this allows our clients to identify the abuse of their logo, even if the domain which was using their logo wasn't a type of squat or wasn't impersonating their own domain. So in the example of Record a Future, it would detect the Record a Future logo being used on the domain. Let's say it's randomsecuritycompany.com, and we could still detect that website impersonating our brand. So this means in the context of Doppelganger, you would still be able to detect networks like Doppelganger using your brand, even if it didn't have a similar domain. And then all the way at the bottom here, we have the more traditional type squatting detection domain abuse alerting rule. So this looks for type of squats, it looks at similar domains, and it's just another way to identify the abuse of your brand. And then you can take actions such as issuing domain takedowns. But these are just some of the ways that you can use Record a Future to protect your brand, prevent against brand protection, prevent against brand abuse, sorry, and including malign influence operations. Well, with that, we'll next move on to CopyCop. So back to you, Brian.
Great, thanks, Craig. So the Russia-linked influence operation CopyCop, it's a newer influence campaign that our team has uncovered and again written extensively about in the last several months. Has expanded to over 120 active websites, many of which that are U.S. elections focused to at least some degree. We currently assess that the CopyCop's objectives with regards to the election are relatively threefold. Denigrate the sitting U.S. administration and Democratic Party leaders. Number two, promote positive coverage of former President Trump's campaign and the Republican Party. And then three, and as you'll see as a common theme with these campaigns, is often to erode that public support for Ukraine. As we discussed, with early on, CopyCop extensively uses generative AI to plagiarize and modify content from legitimate media sources to tailor tailor political messages with specific biases, as well as material that is sourced from pro-Kremlin organizations such as the Foundation of Battle and Justice and the Russian military intelligence linked InfoRos. In recent reporting, we have found CopyCop using generative AI further to plagiarize content from conservative sources based in the United States, and also using AI to create inauthentic journalist personas for its network of websites. Previously, for those that aren't that weren't up to speed on CopyCop, we had linked CopyCop infrastructure to a website known as DC Weekly, which is owned and operated by John Mark Dugan, who is a U.S. citizen living in Russia. CopyCop sources have been used elsewhere to disparage political figures in Europe, including deepfake content. And currently, we assess that CopyCop would likely use similar tactics for election-related content and will likely continue to publish content that is targeted at specific political leaders and candidates in the United States. On this slide here, this is a copy of a graph that we published in our June 2024 update on CopyCop, which just shows the network's information laundering process across Russian state media, U.S. conservative sources, and mainstream UK and French sources. The screenshot below is just one example of one of CopyCop's many cloned websites.
Great, thank you, Brian. And one of the questions we have from the audience as well is adversaries are obviously working on long-term slow burn anti-US narratives, but have we observed quick changes in capitalization on ongoing situations? So how quickly have these threat actors been able to pivot to different current events that are taking place?
Yeah, as I've said, they've been very opportunistic. I think in this election cycle, maybe even more so than in prior cycles, where we see them spinning up content not long after a breaking news event happens. If we take Doppelganger, for example, the attempted assassination of former President Trump occurred on a weekend. We didn't see activity on a Sunday because, well, indicators give us that Doppelganger does not operate on Sundays. But on Monday, we were seeing shortened article headlines covering the attempted assassination, and then the immediate days afterward, cloned websites, social media amplification, and so on. Same deal with CopyCop, and I think a lot of that is kind of linked back to AI and being able to use generative content to produce content at scale and wrap that up quickly. But again, because there's so many different indicators that are giveaways that something is using a large language model or what have you, it doesn't add to the believability or the adaptability that's necessary for an influence operation to take off.
Great, thank you, Brian. And we've seen there that influence actors are heavily using AI, particularly threat actors like CopyCop. So do a very quick demo on how to investigate influence operations using Record Future AI as well. So how to use it as a defender. So just pivot over. So this screen is a screen of Record Future AI, and I can ask it a question such as what information is available about CopyCop. And Record Future AI will provide me with a really nice summary of the network. And what's great is I can actually see the references of where this information is coming from. So in this case, it's coming from Insikt Group. It also gives me the option to ask some follow-up questions. I can type in my own one, or I can select one of the pre-configured ones here. So what are some examples of the new WordPress websites created by CopyCop? And again, it gives me a nice succinct answer to the question that I asked. And again, I can have a look at the original sources here. So what we can actually do with Recorded Future AI as well is actually look at a query for all of the sources from networks like CopyCop, and Recorded Future AI will give us a nice summary of those narratives that we're seeing. So we can actually compare narratives over the weeks and months coming from these different networks. But in this case, we can actually click here to go to the original Insikt Group research. So this is one of the notes that the team here has put together. And on the right here, you also have some recommended queries that Insikt Group experts have created for our clients to then do some onward monitoring. So we can click to see CopyCop domain mentions. And from this, it lists all the different CopyCop domains that have been referenced online. We may want to export this as a CSV to then do some further research, whether that's, detecting, in the case that these were malicious indicators, detect them within our network, or we might want to do some more kind of infrastructure analysis on these indicators to expand our coverage of the CopyCop network. So Recorded Future AI has been a huge help here in telling us more about the CopyCop network in a simple, user-friendly way, and it's allowed us to pivot to relevant domains to conduct our own further research. And next up, we have the Internet Research Agency and NABC. So back over to Brian for this last workshop one.
Great, thanks, Craig. And yes, last one for me, and then we'll let Sean have his time to shine. But yeah, turning to the Internet Research Agency, we've been tracking some limited social media assets that have been previously linked to the IRA-run Newsroom for American and European-based Citizens, or NAEBC, as almost certainly targeting U.S. audiences on alternative social media platforms with 2024 election content. Again, similarly to what we've tracked with this network in 2022 and then with other researchers in 2020, this content more often than not is produced favorably towards the former president, as well as criticism towards U.S. election security and the aforementioned U.S.-Ukraine policy. Just as a quick refresher for folks, the NAEBC was a website operated by the Internet Research Agency, discovered in 2020, and it was used to conduct influence for ahead of that 2020 U.S. election. That analysis was further documented in several reports by our colleagues over at Graphica, as well as the Stanford Internet Research Observatory. In 2022, Insikt Group had reported that some of these alternative social media assets had repurposed themselves to produce a new website focused on election fraud narratives and election security narratives called Election Truth. After the midterms, that network entered sporadic periods of dormancy, including immediately after the exile of IRA financier Evgeny Prigozhin. According to our research, one of the accounts that had reemerged in early 2024 came back online after no reported activity since around 2021. Our data further indicates that other NAEBC-linked accounts impersonating U.S. citizens have engaged with audiences on alternative social media throughout 2024, not as consistently as prior election cycles, but we do see periodic posting with that election-related content. And as of this writing, we have not observed new infrastructure with these accounts like in 2022 or with NAEBC starting out in 2020, though it is something that we continue to track. And then finally, just for the just on this slide, our sample posts from accounts that we attribute to that network.
Great, thank you, Brian. So we have two questions here that are quite similar. The first one is, how quickly are you seeing infrastructure rotation, specifically domains? And the other one's very similar. How often do these actors change infrastructure, and do they tend to use the same pool of hosting solutions?
Yeah, so a good example with this would be with the Doppelganger operation. Many of the original inauthentic news portals had very recently been taken offline after removal by their hosting providers. And so then they had to go and reshift infrastructure, re-register domains, and relying more on bulletproof hosting providers. So we see a lot of that activity. Their with regard to some of the cloned websites that impersonate prominent media, they go and park these domains at a fairly rolling basis. Many of them might just stay dormant and we never see them used in any kind of a campaign. Other ones tend to be used over time in advertising on some social media platforms or occasional use. That would be similar to what we saw recently with the French elections, where they were beginning to branch out from just like traditional news organizations to magazines or lifestyle magazines, and trying to inject content that way, so they kind of diversify their offering. And then CopyCop, it tends to be more of a very spammy approach, and they all tend to follow very similar WordPress construction and registration. So yeah, they tend to roll through those domains a lot, but because so many different eyes that are on the campaigns, and because of the internal tools that we're tracking this with, they're easy to re-identify pretty quickly and get back up to speed.
Great, thank you, Brian. I think I'm right in saying that CopyCop, as soon as we published our first report, they immediately then set up like 120 new domains in response to try and evade our tracking, but we still got them, which is good. So we'll move across from Russia now over to China, and I'll hand it over to Sean.
Thanks, Craig. So we've been monitoring a large-scale coordinated inauthentic behavior network, which is the acronym there is CIB, which I'm sure many have heard of. We've been monitoring this network for quite some time, and we call it Empire Dragon. We also have seen it overlap with networks known as Dragon Bridge and Spamouflage Dragon. And this network is assessed to be likely operated by a Chinese state-aligned actor located in China. And the network continues to be persistent. And we've seen it really focusing on highlighting generally polarizing domestic issues within the United States. Recent examples include things like the anniversary of the death of George Floyd, also exploiting recent protests that we've seen across multiple college campuses here in the US. So the network continues to kind of be on this drumbeat of producing content that is exploiting inherently domestically polarizing issues, not so much candidate focused. And I think the graphics on the top left kind of allude to that, where these are AI generated images we observed amplified by the Empire Dragon network. And you could see here the topic is essentially money and politics, and images included representations of both President Biden and former President Trump. So there's an example of more focused on the topic versus a candidate, which I know that question came up in the chat. And then the network itself is pretty robust, pretty large scale. We've seen it operating on thousands of accounts across, I think it's over 180 platforms, blogs, and websites in over 20 languages. So pretty large scale network. However, so far we've assessed the level of organic engagement to be relatively low. And then correspondingly, we've assessed the effectiveness of the network as far as actually driving any behavior change to be rather negligible. So the network has large scale access and placement on various platforms. However, that engagement looks to be of little effectiveness as of yet, but of course that can change over time. And we can see down the bottom left, this is a recent example from the Empire Dragon network that was covered just earlier this month by Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and that's a deepfake video that was amplified by Empire Dragon that was seeking to discredit the president in the Philippines. And so this is obviously focused on the Philippines, likely in response to the ongoing disputes in the South China Sea. However, we're keeping track of this as it's really showing Empire Dragon's operational capability to integrate and layer deepfake technology within their operations. And we assess that as they've demonstrated the capability, they can easily pivot and use these capabilities against the US election. However, at this time, we haven't seen that specifically for the US election. And back to you, Craig, on Empire Dragon.
Thank you, Sean. So we actually have a question which is really related to your last point there. And the question is, can you talk about other influence operations targeting global elections that have taken place? And if there are any trends, TTPs, or expectations we can draw from those? So you mentioned there the deepfake of the Philippine president. Are there any other trends, TTPs, or expectations we can draw from our research on other influence activity targeting global elections that might apply to the US this year?
Sure. I think we'll kind of stay on topic here as far as the Indo-Pacific region. I think as we were watching the election happening in Taiwan, we did see a increase in more of a robust approach to influence operations that were targeting Taiwan's election. As the election was happening really in the days prior, there was a lot of activity that we attributed to Empire Dragon, and all the way to basically publishing a fictitious novel written by a candidate. So I think with regards to Taiwan, I also think we can discuss a recent report we also did on the elections in France, and watching some of the activities there by some of these same networks to basically target the French elections. Once again, most of that activity seemed to spike really in the days ahead of the election, with more of that. I know somebody in the chat used the term slow burn, which I know we've used often, the kind of lead up to really the weeks, but especially the days prior to the election. So I think examples right now include absolutely the elections that just happened in France, which we do have that public report for reference, and then also some specific examples from Taiwan.
Great, thank you, Sean. And then there's one question we had earlier, which I've been holding off on answering just until we got a little bit further on in the presentation. So the question is, are these influence operations skewed towards one candidate or party as opposed to another, or is it primarily for disruption? And it seems from my side that Brian, kind of, you talked about Russia mainly supporting the Republican side and Trump, and then Sean, I think you mentioned at the beginning with the hack and leak over the weekend by Iran on Trump's campaign, it sounds like they might not want a Republican president and instead want a Democrat president. What are we seeing from China? Has China expressed a preference based on their influence operations so far?
So far, we have not seen a preference, and that's back to the example we provided here, really trying to illustrate the point that they've been focused more on domestic topics. And I think this corresponds with some statements issued by at least the US intelligence community that currently assesses China is taking more of the wait and see approach to this year's elections. And some of that is supported by other intelligence community assessments where China may or may not engage in more large-scale cyber-enabled influence operations based on the risk appetite to really overall risk any type of competition with the US in certain regions as far as reputation goes. So as China competes with the US in different regions around the world, I think that consideration on reputational risk is definitely at play right now. And what we can see Empire Dragon essentially echoing based on the content is more of this wait and see approach, where it's not overly aggressive and it's not really candidate specific. It's just this drumbeat based on polarizing domestic issues.
Great, thank you so much, Sean. For the audience members, please keep the questions rolling in. As you can see, we're trying to answer as many as we can today during this webinar. So next we'll move over to Iran, and hand back to you for this one, Sean.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, shifting focus here again. So to begin, I'll just go ahead and summarize briefly what happened over the weekend, because there is some connections here with this network, which we call International Union of Virtual Media, the acronym being IUVM. So to back up, this past really Friday and Saturday, there was a decent amount of open source reporting that broke into the news cycle, and essentially a network affiliated with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps reportedly conducted a hack and leak of an unidentified presidential campaign. And then about 24 hours later, we saw more open source reporting that suggested the presidential campaign that was alluded to was former US President Donald Trump's campaign. And then the Trump campaign acknowledged that the hack and leak took place and basically involved so far an unidentified entity, basically hacking into private communications, being emails of the campaign, and acquiring documents that were internal communication documents, and then delivering those to Politico, the news organization. And so far, there's no direct attribution to Iran. However, based on the combination of reporting basically discussing a specific Iran affiliated network that's part of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps intelligence organization, and combined with the Trump campaign alluding to the fact that this was Iran, this was most certainly likely an Iranian actor that conducted this hack and leak, which is consistent with our assessments up to this point, that we do assess, similar to 2020, that Iran's going to ramp up the cyber-enabled influence operations as the election gets closer. And to now kind of close the gap here with the network we'll talk about for Iran today is this IUVM. We'll go ahead and just use the acronym to keep it short. IUVM's been a persistent network that was actually sanctioned by the US government in 2020 for election interference. And the US Department of Justice actually did a large amount of takedowns of domains affiliated with IUVM. And we've watched IUVM persist in the information environment ever since 2020. Essentially, it appears most of the domains were taken down, but not all of them. And then since 2020, new infrastructure affiliated with the network has been developed and remains operational. So once again, IUVM is affiliated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, similar to what we saw over the past weekend. And we've really seen back, I know somebody asked this question in the chat as well, but the cyclical approach. So with the cyclical approach for Iran, what we're meaning to articulate there is essentially a cycle of content where the content usually can originate either from an authoritarian website, such as the Supreme Leader's personal website, or from a covert website, such as one of the websites affiliated with IUVM. So content can originate really either in a completely overt authoritarian website or a covert website, and then kind of matriculate itself onto social media from accounts that are affiliated with Iran. So it's essentially a cycle where you have even overt content from authoritarian websites such as Khamenei.com, things like that, and then appearing on social media and then getting engagement on social media that's organic and from audiences in the US. And it kind of continues, and the cycle will continue where content produced from either covert or overt Iranian sources will matriculate onto popular social media platforms and gain additional exposure there. And specific to what we've seen recently with IUVM is the development of a cluster of accounts that go by the name of Hupo platform. And these accounts that are called Hupo platform are on multiple different social media platforms. And these accounts were developed around June, really till now. So during this year, these were newly developed accounts. We assess them as affiliated with IUVM, and likely Iran's intention to develop some new infrastructure ahead of the elections. And right now, these Hupo platforms, that the bottom left images are representations of some of the content that they're producing. And so far, there's rather minimal engagement. However, back to that access and placement that these accounts maintain, we assess the engagement. I mean, it's already increased a little bit, and it'll probably continue to increase as time goes on. So overall, we're watching IUVM just continue to persist in the information environment and developing new infrastructure, which we assess will likely continue as we move closer to November.
Great, thank you, Sean. And we'll move right on into the final piece, which is domestic violent extremists. So back to you, Sean, for this one.
Thanks, Craig. We're also monitoring various individuals and groups that we categorize as domestic violent extremists. And we've seen, we'll use the acronym DVEs, continue to threaten various targets, which include election officials, personnel affiliated with elections, and we assess as the election gets closer, we'll definitely see more threats towards infrastructure and facilities associated with the elections. And overall threats we've seen that continue to increase from DVEs include things from physical attack to approaching and threatening individuals, also specifically harassing, and then as well as doxing campaigns and swatting campaigns. And the key factor that kind of connects DVEs right now with the rest of this presentation is what we're seeing happen is these individuals and groups are conducting what we term a feedback loop with some of the governments that we've spoken about, where essentially a DVE actor will opportunistically essentially co-opt narratives that are emerging from some of these other networks that complement their pre-existing ideological goals, and then they will continue to basically amplify that existing narrative within the information space in pursuit of their own objectives, which essentially just nest with these narratives produced by entities or these networks we discussed that are affiliated with governments. And we saw this specifically with the recent attempted assassination on former President Trump. Following that, Iran, for example, and IUVM network, since we just spoke about that, IUVM was projecting the narrative that the attempted assassination on former President Trump was staged by the Trump campaign to basically increase support. And we saw groups, DVEs, basically take that and run with it and continue to post content pushing the same narrative. So once again, essentially that feedback loop, which we assess will almost certainly continue as we move closer.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, that feedback loop's really interesting. And I know we've talked about that in past reports as well, like the Hawaii wildfires a while ago. There was that feedback loop between those state-sponsored influence actors and domestic violent extremists too. And so one of the threats Sean just mentioned on that last slide was the doxing of election-related personnel. And doxing is also a threat to company executives and other public figures too. Researchers found that those who are doxed by DVEs are a heightened risk of physical threats, such as harassment, stalking, protests, surveillance, and even physical attacks, as well as cyber threats too. So in the Record a Future platform, you can monitor for impersonation attempts of your executives, as well as mentions of your executives on popular doxing sources. In this example, let's take Doxbin. So a query like this one on the screen will show you all the different results in the time frame that you selected. Obviously, it's heavily blacked out here because I don't want to be showing someone's personal information on a webinar with hundreds of people. And the great news is we also cache all that information in the Record a Future platform as well. So you can see the full results, including what information was included in the docs. You as an internal team can then take that information, verify whether it's accurate or not. And we actually published a report, I think it was earlier this year, called Violent Extremists Dox Executives Enabling Physical Threats. That's on our public website. And if you have a look in there, there's a huge list of mitigations, both to reduce the chances that you're doxed, as well as what to do if you are doxed as well. So really important resource there for any election defenders, any public figures, but also any of our clients on the line who are interested in the executive protection use case. So with that, we'll go over to questions. We've got many more questions, and we'll go for another about 5 minutes. So let me just take a look. So one of the questions, Brian and Sean, Brian, maybe I'll come to you first to talk about Russia. Is it feasible to block all social media influence and propaganda coming from China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea? It looks like they're blocking influence from the USA. Is that feasible?
It is and isn't. It is and it isn't. I think when we talk about restricting access to, let's just say over state media, for example, like at RT or Sputnik News or Press TV or what have you, I think when we go about blocking or restricting access to those sources, we run into a couple different issues. Number one, there's going to be attempts to kind of circumvent bans or restrictions like we've seen with RT and in Europe through pseudo anonymous accounts on YouTube or other social media to promote articles from those sources, and then more of just that covert activity. On the flip side as well, the response from those adversarial nation states to restrict Western reporting is also something we've been seeing a lot, especially in Russia, with just restrictions on more of that independent press or foreign media, or what they label as like foreign agent entities. So it can be done. We've seen that in the EU with a lot of those restrictions on state media, but I think sometimes it can do a little bit more harm than good, especially when you try to go about tracking these networks and keeping an eye on them. For some of the more covert social media, like with Doppelganger, just the volume of account creation and cycling of those accounts are single use, they're automated beginning to end. It makes it very, very hard, I think, to effectively restrict all of that.
Great, thanks, Brian. Yeah, I guess especially with social media platforms, when you live in a open and democratic society, I guess one of the weaknesses of that is it's easier to permeate into those platforms, and it's easier to disguise that activity as well. Another question we have here, which I'll take for myself: what does Recorded Future do to prevent partisan bias from tainting the deliverables of intelligence staff? So for this one, I would just highlight that we're all intelligence professionals. We have people from across a variety of backgrounds. We have a very diverse team. We have some people trained in military and government, and we address all of our subjects from a very intelligence analysis mindset. So we check any biases, we check any fallacies, we do lots of peer review of work. We'll never include emotive language or biased language in our reports. And we're really focused on foreign adversaries trying to influence the elections. So we're not interested in who wins in our analysis. We're not interested in, even kind of domestic false information. We're really focused on that foreign adversaries and DVEs as well. So one of the next questions we have as well: what guidance or recommendations do you have for a technical information security team supporting journalist organizations or newsrooms? Who wants to take that one?
I guess I'll go ahead and jump in, Craig. I think we hit that pretty well earlier with your demonstration of at least the Recorded Future ability for monitoring different brands, and things like impersonating news organizations is something we have directly seen some of these networks do, which I know Brian discussed in detail. So beyond, of course, mentioning Recorded Future and using threat intelligence to continue to monitor these networks, I do think it's really about monitoring proactively and trying to identify these networks in nascent stages before they do develop into something that is capable of changing behavior based on those consuming the resulting content. And I think to answer, I know another question that came up in the chat is, yeah, despite the fact that we have assessed most of these networks to have relatively low levels of impact, some of that also is likely due to the fact that a few of these networks are relatively new in the timeline of influence operations. Influence operations generally take a decent amount of time. They're not usually short burn type of operations, just based on the establishment of infrastructure, conditioning different target audiences, and then ultimately trying to engage in that behavior change. So really taking that long-term approach to fully understand the emerging networks, where they're coming from, where new networks may come from, and then monitoring that continuously to be proactive in mitigation measures, whether that's takedown efforts or just education across the board, which I think is also important.
Great, thank you, Sean. And yeah, I would just add to that as well that, journalists, they are public figures. I think they're a great group of individuals that should be looked after as executives with that executive protection use case. So looking at any doxing attempts, making sure there's additional monitoring around them too. So definitely check out that doxing report, which we have on our public website. Another question we have is AI-driven analysis is mentioned as a key strategy for processing large volumes of influence content. What are current limitations of AI in this context, and how can these be addressed to enhance its effectiveness? I think from this side, it's a great point. As we demonstrated earlier on in the webinar, we do use AI ourselves to help analyze the narratives of some of these influence networks. I think we will see a bit of an arms race over time of, can AI detect whether something is written by AI? With deepfakes as well, can we use AI to efficiently detect deepfakes? And will it be able to do so quick enough as well? Because once there is a damaging deepfake, that can cause harm pretty much immediately, even before it's debunked. So there are certain limitations there. I do think it's going to be a bit of an AI arms race over the next few years in particular. And then we will take one quick one. How frequently do we encounter mentions of DV physical attacks on private sector critical infrastructure? We do have a report on that for our clients. So if you're unsure, just reach out to your customer success manager and they'll make sure to get that report across to you. And then one final question. So we have one here. In the case of novel campaigns, how do you go about assessing the intended objective of influence operations? Brian, do you want to take that one?
Sure, and I see in the chat what was brought up is Operation Overload, which is a fascinating campaign in of itself, because it seems like there's multiple tiers to that campaign and what it attempts to achieve, whether that's overloading resources with fake fact checking, or is it trying to inject subtly pro-Kremlin narratives or narratives that try to incite violence. Well, oftentimes we look back at some of the strategic objectives of some of the nation states that are either attributed back to that activity or have some of the linkages or technical indicators as being from that certain geographic region. Like what are their primary motivations? What are their interests? Current conflicts, economic interests, and so on. If there's attributable activity to say Russia, for example, and we're looking at impersonation of a news website or what have you, obviously I think that's partially to give the appearance of something that is real and easily adoptable. In the case of Operation Overload, we see that a lot with whether they're fake social media stories or they're similarly to Doppelganger, like fake video clips impersonating Western media of of injecting a narrative to promote kind of discontent or something that might cause a little bit of like influence paralysis or political paralysis. And so with some of the networks like that, it's kind of the cause that internal chaos, also inject those narratives, but also at the same time with like Op Overload, overwhelm resources with fake fact checking leads and dedicate resources away from actual propaganda issues or issues in the information space. Hopefully that's helpful.
Great, thank you, Brian. Well, that's about time. We've been able to answer over 20 questions there. Apologies that we didn't get to them all. Hopefully you found today's brief useful. Please reach out if you've got any questions. And again, the report, Malign Influence Threats Mount Ahead of the US 2024 elections, is available on our public website now. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Brian, for your great insights. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.